USS Arizona, or BB-39, was the second of the Pennsylvania-class battleships, the younger sister of USS Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania-class were significantly larger than the preceding Nevada-class. Arizona had an overall length of 608 feet, a beam of 97 feet, and a draft of 29 feet 3 inches at deep load. That was about 25 feet longer than the preceding ships. She would displace 29,626 tons at standard load and 32,429 tons at deep load, which was over 4,060 tons more than the older ships as well. Her crew would number 56 officers and 1,031 enlisted men, as built. She was equipped with 4 direct-drive Parsons steam turbine sets, which drove a prop that was 12 feet 1.5 inches in diameter. The steam was provided by 12 Babcock and Wilcox boilers, and the turbines were designed to supply about 34,000 shaft horsepower, though during her sea trials they managed to only hit 33,376. But she did meet her design speed of 21 knots. And later she would reach a speed of 21.5 knots during a full power trial in September of 1924. Her designed range was 8,000 nautical miles at 12 knots. Her main armament consisted of 12 14-inch guns in triple turrets, which were numbered 1 to 4 from the rear. Her secondary armament consisted of 22 5-inch guns mounted in individual casemates in the sides of her hull. She also had 4 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, though when she first started her trial she actually only had 2. She also had 2 21-inch torpedo tubes that were underwater, one on each broadside. And the Pennsylvanias, as a class, continued the all-or-nothing design principle for armor, which basically dictates that they put very, very little to zero armor in non-vital areas of the ship, and put effectively all of the armor in very critical areas. As a result of this, Arizona's waterline armor belt measured 13.5 inches thick, but it covered only her machinery spaces and magazines, and it would taper to a minimum thickness of just 8 inches in other areas. Her main armor deck was 3 plates thick, but with a total thickness of 3 inches in most areas, but over the steering gear, the armor was increased to 6.25 inches in 2 plates. She also had a 3-inch torpedo bulkhead that was placed 9 feet 6 inches inboard from her side, and she was provided with a complete double bottom. Arizona was laid down on March 16, 1914, with Assistant Secretary of the Navy and future President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in attendance. The builders actually intended to set a world record 10 months between the ship's keel laying and launch. The New York Times called the ship the world's biggest and most powerful, both offensively and defensively. But the world record never happened. She was only a little over half done a year later. Eventually, though, she was launched on June 19, 1915, and she was named Arizona by the Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels. But her launching still held a great amount of fanfare. The New York Times estimated that there were at least 75,000 people in attendance, and that included John Perroy Mitchell, who was the mayor of New York City, and George W.P. Hunt, who was the governor of Arizona at the time, as well as many high-ranking military officials. Several other battleships were also nearby to watch their new family member take to the water. That included Florida, Utah, Wyoming, Arkansas, New York, and Texas. Esther Ross was given the honors of ship sponsor and christening, and to acknowledge the ban on alcohol that was recently passed by the state legislature, the state's governor decided that 2 bottles would be used, one full of sparkling wine from Ohio, and another filled with water from the Roosevelt Dam. Arizona would be officially commissioned into the Navy on October 17, 1916, with Captain John McDonald in command. She departed New York on November 10th, after her crew had cleaned her and the propulsion system had been tested at the dock. She sailed south for her shakedown cruise, but outside Guantanamo Bay, she suffered a stripped turbine on December 7th, and that forced her to head back to New York for repairs. though it wasn't so bad a malfunction that she couldn't take a pit stop in Chesapeake Bay to test her main and secondary gun batteries, and those tests went fine. When she returned to New York, it was discovered that the turbine couldn't actually be fixed while it was still inside of Arizona, which meant they had to remove it, which wasn't easy. They had to cut holes in her upper decks to lift the damaged casing out, and it was reinstalled after almost 4 months of repairs. Arizona finally got back to her duties on April 3rd, 1917, but just 3 days after that, the United States would declare war on Germany and officially enter World War I. Arizona would be assigned to Battleship Division 8, operating out of the York River, but she was employed only as a gunnery training ship for crewmen on armed merchant vessels that were crossing the Atlantic on convoys. 8 of her 5-inch guns would actually be removed to be equipped on merchant ships, and when she sailed near the wreck of the old San Marcos, she would actually use it for target practice. San Marcos was actually the pre-dreadnought USS Texas, renamed so they could use the name Texas for the newer super dreadnought. Very rarely did Arizona actually go into the ocean due to the threat of U-boats, and on the occasion she did venture out, it was only in the company of her fellow battleships and other escorts. 4 of the coal-fired American dreadnoughts were sent across the ocean to the UK in December of 1917 as Battleship Division 9, but Arizona was not included. She was held back, and her crew spent most of their time training, and when they weren't doing that, they participated in some leisure activities, like boat racing. They actually won the Battenberg Cup in July of 1918 by beating the team from USS Nevada by 3 lengths over a 9-mile course. World War I would draw to a close November 11th, 1918, and a week later, Arizona did leave the United States for the UK, arriving there on November 30th. She spent 2 weeks berthed at Portland Harbor in Dorset, and then sailed for France. On December 13th, she joined 9 other battleships and 28 destroyers who were escorting the President, Woodrow Wilson, on the ocean liner George Washington into Brest during Wilson's journey to the Paris Peace Conference. All 10 battleships departed France the next day, arriving back in New York on December 26, and were greeted by parades, celebrations, as well as a full naval review by Secretary Daniels. Arizona was the first in the line, and rendered a 19-gun salute to Secretary Daniels. Along with the rest of her family, she was anchored off New York City for the next several weeks, and was actually open to the public as part of the celebratory events. You don't get to do that much anymore at all. That sounds great, though. Post-World War I, well, we are in the interwar period, and in most other videos, I've kind of jumped through this because it's pretty dull. But if you know anything about Arizona, you know that there's a good reason why I'm gonna take my time a little bit here, and give you as much information about her life as possible. The first thing she did after celebrations died down was sailing from New York for Hampton Roads on January 22nd, 1919, and then she continued south to Guantanamo Bay, arriving there on February 8th. Her time spent in the Caribbean was mostly for training purposes, as would become pretty customary in the 20s and 30s. There wasn't much else for a warship to do. In April, her crew won the Battenberg Cup again for the 2nd straight year in a row, before she was deployed to France to escort President Wilson back to the United States. While she was waiting for Wilson's departure, she was actually redeployed in Turkey in response to tensions between Greece and Italy over rewarding what is now Izmir to Greece in the Paris Peace Treaty. Italy felt that it should have been theirs, and both governments had each deployed a major warship to the area to enforce their own personal interests. Arizona was there to try to make it so that things did not get completely out of hand, though in a way they still kinda did. Shortly after she arrived, Greek ground forces actually arrived in transports and were offloaded in the port. This resulted in some pretty sizable chaos in the city, and there were American citizens there at the time. They sought refuge on board Arizona, and of course she took them. The crisis would eventually die down, and then Arizona was ordered to Constantinople, now Istanbul. Istanbul, not Constantinople. No, it's Istanbul, not Constantinople. Before she sailed for home on June 15th. She was sent to the New York Navy Yard on June 30th for an overhaul, where 6 5-inch guns were actually removed and her fire control system was modernized. Work on her was completed in January of 1920, and then she sailed south back to Guantanamo Bay for further training. During that time, she was fitted with a flying-off platform that was very similar to the one that had been given to USS Texas in March 1919. Then in April, Arizona finally lost the Battenberg Cup to Nevada, taking her revenge. And then in June, Arizona was present for the Naval Academy's graduation ceremonies. In August, she became the flagship for Battleship Division 7, although it was only later in 1920 that she was refitted to actually be an admiral's flagship. Along with 6 fellow battleships and 18 destroyers, Arizona would be sent south to transit the Panama Canal in January of 1921. She met up with the Pacific Fleet, and then continued on to Peru for a week before the two fleets combined to practice battle maneuvers. After a short return to the Atlantic, which did include an overhaul in New York, Arizona, who was under the command of Jehu V. Chase, returned to Peru in the summer before she began operating from her new home port of San Pedro, California, where she would remain based until 1940. For the rest of the 20s, everything Arizona did consisted of routine training exercises. Pretty much the only other thing of note was that on July 27, 1923, she, while under the command of John Y.R. Blakely, joined President Warren G. Harding's Naval Review in Seattle, Washington. Harding would actually die just 1 week after this, and Arizona joined the Pacific Fleet to fire a salute in his honor on August 3rd. Then there was also the Madeline Blair incident. Now, I've already made a standalone video about that, but long story short, Madeline Blair was a, lady of the night in New York, and she would wind up stowing away on Arizona in an effort to get to California with the help of some of her crew. She would also ply her particular trade while on board, though she was found out and left in Balboa, Panama, eventually being sent back to New York. It was a, ridiculous situation, quite frankly. 4 months after the latest fleet problem number 9, another training exercise, in January of 1929, Arizona was modernized at the Norfolk Navy Yard. She was given brand new tripod masts, which were surmounted by 3-tiered fire control directors for the main and secondary armament. And the number of 5-inch guns was reduced to just 12, and they were repositioned 1 deck higher, and 8 5-inch guns replaced the 3-inch guns that she had had before. Those changes would also increase her crew to 92 officers and 1,639 enlisted men. Her main gun turrets were also modified to increase the maximum elevation of their guns up to 30 degrees. Her compressed air catapults on the quarterdeck was replaced with one that used black powder, and her deck armor was also increased by the addition of 1 3/4-inch special treatment steel, and she was also given anti-torpedo bulges, as well as being given an additional bulkhead to the sides of her boiler rooms. Her torpedo tubes were also removed, as by that time it was pretty clear that torpedoes on battleships would likely never really be used, given that battleship tactics had evolved into very long-range engagements, and that alteration permitted the large transverse flats in which the tubes had been situated to be subdivided to reduce risks of flooding in action. Her machinery was also almost entirely replaced. Her high-pressure turbines were replaced by more powerful geared turbines that were taken from the canceled battleship Washington, and she was given 6 new boilers. Their additional power offset her increased displacement, and she was able to hit 20.7 knots, with 35,081 shaft horsepower, and now had a displacement of 38,258 tons. Into the 1930s, on March 19th, 1931, even before Arizona had actually done her post-modernization sea trials, she played host to President Herbert Hoover for his vacation in the Caribbean. He visited Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands during this time. When she returned on March 29th, she was able to actually conduct her sea trials properly at Rockland, Maine, and she was given another catapult that was fitted on top of turret number 3, before she was transferred back to the West Coast in August with her sister, Pennsylvania. In February of 1932, she participated in Grand Joint Exercise No. 4, in which carrier aircraft successfully attacked Pearl Harbor on Sunday morning, February 7th. That's eerie. After she returned back to the West Coast from fleet problem number 13 in 1933, she was anchored in San Pedro when an earthquake struck nearby Long Beach, California on March 10th. Members of her crew joined relief efforts, and they provided food, treated the injured, and presented added security from looters. In early 1934, she and her crew were actually filmed for the James Cagney Warner Brothers film Here Comes the Navy, which made extensive use of exterior footage as well as onboard location shots. Then in the early morning, on July 26 of that year, Arizona would actually collide with a fishing trawler, Umatilla, that was under tow by another trawler off of Cape Flattery. 2 men on board Umatilla were killed in this accident, and the Navy convened a court of inquiry to investigate. The court recommended that the ship's captain, Captain McGillivray Milne, be court-martialed. This all happened at Guantanamo Bay Naval Base in Cuba, while she was participating in that year's fleet problem. Milne was actually judged guilty, and was replaced several months later by Captain George Baum, after Arizona returned to the West Coast. Rear Admiral Samuel W. Bryant assumed command of Battleship Division 2 on September 4th, with Arizona as his flagship. Rear Admiral George T. Pettengill relieved Bryant on March 4th, 1935, and then Arizona participated in another fleet problem, number 16, 2 months after that. Arizona would make a port visit to Balboa in May of 1936 during fleet problem 17, and on June 8th, Captain George A. Alexander relieved Baum as captain, and 15 days later, Rear Admiral Claude C. Bloch relieved Pettengill. During gunnery practice on July 24th, the combustion gases from one gun on turret 2 actually entered the gun turret, and that burned one crewman. The turret's sprinkling system was turned on to prevent any kind of powder explosion, but this of course released water which leaked into the turret's electrical switchboard and started a small fire, which was the opposite of what was supposed to happen, though it was easily put out. Due to the Navy's limited budget at the time, Arizona spent most of this period in port as a fuel-saving measure. During the fiscal year 1936 to 37, she was anchored for 267 days, and the following year, she was in port for 255 days. On January 2nd, 1937, Rear Admiral John Greenslade assumed command of Battleship Division 2 from Bloch and transferred his flag to the battleship Maryland. On April 13th, Rear Admiral Manly H. Simons, who was the commander of Battleship Division 1, transferred his flag to Arizona on August 7th. He was relieved by Rear Admiral Adolphus E. Watson on November 8th. Captain Alfred Windsor Brown relieved Baum on December 11th. And then Arizona participated in yet another fleet problem, number 19, off Hawaii, in April and May of 1938. Captain Brown actually died in his sleep on September 7th, and Captain Isaac C. Kidd then assumed command on September 17th, 1938. That same day, Rear Admiral Chester Nimitz actually assumed command of Battleship Division 1, though he would also be relieved May 27, 1939, by Rear Admiral Russell Wilson. Captain Harold C. Train assumed command of the ship on February 5, 1940. Her last fleet problem was off Hawaii in April and May of 1940, and at the conclusion, the United States Pacific Fleet was retained in Hawaiian waters and based at Pearl Harbor. The intention of this was to deter Japanese expansion. She would be overhauled at the Puget Sound Navy Yard in Bremerton, Washington, from October 1940 to January of 1941, and during that refit, the foundation for a search radar was added atop her foremast. Her anti-aircraft directors were also upgraded, and a platform for 4 water-cooled 50-inch M2 Browning machine guns was installed at the very top of her mainmast. Her last flag change of command occurred on January 23, 1941, when Wilson was relieved by Isaac Kidd. Captain Franklin von Valkenburg relieved Train on February 5, 1941, and on October 22, 1941, during an exercise that was taking place in heavy fog, Arizona was actually hit in the bow by Oklahoma, and she'd actually been scheduled to depart for Bremerton Navy Yard in November to undergo an overhaul, but the accident made it so that she couldn't make the journey without first being dry docked at Pearl for repairs, so as a result, she would remain in Hawaii. Her last sortie was a night firing exercise on the night of December 4th as part of Battleship Division 1, alongside both Nevada and Oklahoma. All three of them would moor along Ford Island on the following day in Battleship Row, and on December 6th, the repair ship, Vestal, came alongside her to assist her crew with some minor repair work. Shortly before 8 o'clock local time on December 7th, 1941, Japanese aircraft from 6 of their carriers struck the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. On board Arizona, her air raid alarm went off at around 7:55, and she went to general quarters shortly after that. Just after 8, 10 Nakajima B-5N2 Kate torpedo bombers, 5 from the carrier Kaga and 5 from Hiryu, descended on Arizona. They were not carrying torpedoes, they were carrying modified armor-piercing shells that effectively served as 1,757-pound bombs. They flew at an altitude of 3,000 meters, and Kaga's aircraft bombed Arizona from amidships to stern. Hiryu's would hit the bow area. Arizona was hit at least 4 times, as well as suffering 3 near misses. One of the near misses off the port bow actually made observers think that she had been torpedoed, though it's not believed she was ever actually hit by a torpedo during the attack. The sternmost bomb would ricochet off the face of turret 4 and penetrate the deck to detonate in the captain's pantry, which caused a small fire. One of the forward hits was near the port edge of the ship, abreast the mainmast, and detonated in the area of the anti-torpedo bulkhead. The next bomb would strike near the port rear 5-inch anti-aircraft gun, but it was the very last bomb that was the most devastating. It struck Arizona at around 8:06, somewhere around turret 2. This bomb probably penetrated the armored deck near the magazines located in the forward section of the ship, and 7 seconds after it struck, those magazines would detonate, causing a horrific explosion. The fires caused by this explosion would burn for 2 days, and debris showered all over the immediate area. The blast was so powerful that it actually put out fires that were on board the repair ship Vestal. And all told, between the initial bombs and the explosion, 1,177 of Arizona's crew would die in the attack, and they encompassed roughly half of the total lives lost on that day. Several sailors would receive the Medal of Honor for their conduct on board Arizona. Lieutenant Commander Samuel G. Fuqua, who was the ship's damage control officer, was awarded it for his cool-headedness while he worked to quell the fires and get survivors off the destroyed Arizona. Posthumous awards of the medal also went to 2 high-ranking officers who were on board Arizona when she was destroyed. Rear Admiral Kidd would become the first flag officer that was killed in the Pacific War, and Captain von Valkenburg, who reached the bridge and was attempting to defend his ship when the explosion went off. Arizona herself was also given 1 battle star for her service in World War II. As far as what caused the explosion exactly, there are 2 major competing hypotheses, and it's likely we'll never know exactly which one is correct. But the first one is that the bomb detonated in or very close to the black powder magazine that was used for the ship's saluting guns and catapult charges. That would have detonated first, and then ignited the smokeless powder magazines, which were used for the main armament. A 1944 Navy Bureau of Ships report suggested that a hatch leading to the black powder was left open. The Naval History and Heritage Command explained that black powder might have been stockpiled outside the armored magazine as well. The alternative explanation is that the bomb penetrated the armored decks and detonated directly inside one of the starboard magazines for the main armament, But the problem with this is that smokeless powder is actually pretty difficult to detonate, which is why they had black powder pads to quickly ignite the smokeless stuff. The time elapsed from the bomb hit to the magazine explosion was also shorter than experience suggests. Burning smokeless powder required to explode, but either way it doesn't really matter. Like I said, a definitive explanation has never really been drawn up, and surviving physical evidence isn't sufficient to determine the exact cause. What is known is that Arizona, and most of her crew, died that day. After the attack, she was placed in ordinary, which means she was declared to be temporarily out of service, though she would be stricken from the Naval Vessel Register by December 1st, 1942, because in Arizona's case, especially when compared to the other battleships around her, she was so badly destroyed that even if she could be salvaged, it was not thought she could be returned to service at all, and that left her to the same fate of the two other battleships that died at Pearl Harbor: Utah, who had been serving as a training vessel, and Oklahoma, who was so old that returning her to service just didn't seem reasonable. Arizona's surviving superstructure was scrapped in 1942, and her main armament was also salvaged over the next year and a half. The aft main gun turrets were removed and reinstalled as United States Army Coast Artillery Corps' Battery Arizona on the west coast of Oahu and Battery Pennsylvania on the Makapu Peninsula. Battery Pennsylvania would actually fire its guns for the first and last time on VJ Day in August of 1945 while training. Battery Arizona was actually never completed. Both forward turrets were left in place, but the guns from Turret 2 were salvaged and installed on USS Nevada in the fall of 1944. After being straightened and realigned, Nevada would fire those same guns against the Japanese islands of Okinawa and Iwo While Oklahoma was partially refloated and planned for scrapping, Arizona, like Utah, was left in place. She wasn't considered a navigational hazard, and eventually would be considered a war grave and memorial. Contrary to some popular belief, Arizona isn't actually perpetually in commission like USS Constitution is. Arizona is under the control of the National Park Service, though the Navy still retains the title. And while she isn't in commission, she retains the right, in perpetuity, to fly the US flag as if she were an active commissioned naval vessel. On March 7th, 1950, Admiral Arthur W. Radford, who was the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet at that time, instituted the raising of colors over Arizona's remains, and legislation that would be passed during the administrations of both Presidents Dwight D. Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy, who were both also veterans of World War II, would result in the designation of Arizona as a national shrine in 1962. A memorial was built across her remains, and that included a shrine room that lists the names of every lost crew member on a marble wall. The memorial was listed on the National Register of Historic Places on October 15, 1966, and Arizona herself was designated a National Historic Landmark on May 5, 1989. Like with Utah, survivors of the attack may choose to have their ashes placed within Arizona along with their fallen comrades, and veterans who served on her at other times are permitted to have their ashes scattered in the water above the ship. While Arizona's superstructure and 2 of the 4 main gun turrets are gone, the barbette of one of the turrets remains visible above the water, and ever since her sinking, oil still, to this day, leaks from her hull, roughly 2.3 quarts a day. In 2004, both the US Navy and the National Park Service did do a comprehensive computerized mapping of Arizona, while at the same time being very careful to respect it as a war grave, and they considered using non-intrusive means of trying to restrict the flow of oil out of her, which is commonly referred to as the tears of the Arizona, but to this day that hasn't been done, mostly because it's actually not necessary. Nature is adaptable, and over the years, the bay has gotten used to the oil being there. It's such a small amount at a time that's almost negligible, and certain microbes are actually benefiting from it, It was discovered that if they were to attempt to remove the oil, even with minimal non-intrusive means, not only would there be a risk of damaging the Arizona further, or releasing far more oil that would be devastating, but it would also, no matter what, disrupt the current ecosystem that is built up around her. And thus the conclusion is that it's best to let her lay, and continue weeping for her own death, as well as that of her crews. But not all the remains of Arizona are, well, with her. One of her original bells now hangs in the University of Arizona Student Union Memorial Center. One of her guns, a mast, and anchor are in Wesley Bolin Memorial Plaza, which is just east of the Arizona State Capitol complex in downtown Phoenix. And the gun's plaque actually points out that it wasn't on the ship during the Pearl Harbor attack, but was being relined for mounting on Battleship Nevada. It is paired, symbolically, with a gun from Battleship Missouri, to represent the start and end of the Pacific War for the United States. Other artifacts from Arizona, like items from her silver service, are on permanent exhibit in the Arizona State Capitol Museum, and every 2 years the Navy awards the USS Arizona Memorial Trophy to a ship that has received the highest combat readiness in strike warfare, surface fire support, and anti-surface warfare, as determined by the Chief of Naval Operations. The 3-foot-tall bronze trophy, which sits on a black marble base, was actually provided to the Navy by the citizens of the state of Arizona on December 7th, 1987. Arizona still sits at the bottom of Pearl, right where she came to rest all those years ago. The memorial to USS Oklahoma is just nearby, and a bit further down are the remains of USS Utah. And while Arizona is left to cry her tears, she's watched over by USS Missouri, who sits in a constant, silent vigil over the graves of her cousins. The death of Arizona started World War II for the United States, and the sacrifice of her and her crew should never be forgotten. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders, Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, and Zeg A1 Arthur Roy, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Brian, Jack Carson's Roro Videos, Lord Off 444, Mark Holding, Murder Drones Doll, A Person 723, DM Tribal Typhoon, Roro Huzz 2860, Isurfer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matthew Wolf, Mr. Sleepy, Matt Weaver, Tom Red Lion, NS Productions 8104, Hannah Bird, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhounds, The Baxter, Caleb Crosswhite, Ohio Trucker 1, Joshua Long, Andrew Bowen, Dr. Racer 78, Josh Johnson, Hayden DeGrow, Travis Delinsky, Caleb Rainwaters, Prez Drenton, Master of None, and Oklahoma Hot Rail. Till next time, this is Darkness and a bit of fun. Farewell.